Welcome to TOCHI Stories. Please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on post notification because it will mean the whole world to me. Now let's get right into the story. Brace yourself. The rain had just stopped when Chief Oena Okafor's black Lexus slowed to a crawl near the narrow alley off Ajagunno Road. The city was sinking into the humid silence of midnight, but something about that alley clung to the billionaire's mind like a stubborn whisper. He had left the boardroom in anger hours earlier, fed up with the vultures in his company who pretended to respect him while undermining his decisions. Now, with the AC humming low and city lights casting long shadows across the cracked windscreen, his eyes drifted to the right, where a pile of trash swelled by the gutter. At first, it looked like just another mound of waste. Plastic bags, torn clothes, discarded wrappers. But a shape shifted. A fragile human figure curled among them like a forgotten ragdoll. "Olga, make we go," the driver mumbled nervously, avoiding eye contact. But Oena raised a hand slowly. Something was off. Something was wrong. Against every logical voice in his head, he stepped out into the damp air. The stench was unbearable, a mix of wet cardboard, rotten food, and urine. But the woman lying there made his heart pause. Her skin was bruised and pale, her lips cracked, and her limbs stiff as though she had given up breathing hours ago. She wasn't moving, except for a faint rise and fall of her chest, subtle like a child hiding from pain. Her dress, if it could still be called that, hung in rags across her thin body. Her hair was matted with dirt, face swollen in one eye, lips cut at the corner. Oena stood still, locked in place. She could have been anyone. A drug addict, a prostitute, a thief, a victim. But something about her presence disturbed him deeply. He didn't understand it, not then, not fully. But it felt like a thread had snapped inside him, one that connected to a sorrow he hadn't touched in years. "Pick her up," he barked suddenly. The driver hesitated. "Sir." "I said pick her up," Oena shouted, his voice cracking like thunder. The driver obeyed. The woman was limp, soaked, and barely breathing. They drove to the nearest private hospital, leaving the alley behind, but not the memory. Inside the hospital, the nurses looked at the woman with a practiced coldness. They asked if she was a relative. Oena said no. They asked if he was sure he wanted to admit her. People like her rarely had names, let alone survival chances. Oena's answer was simple. Do what you'd do if it was your mother lying there. They admitted her, hooked her to drips, cleaned her wounds, bandaged her bruises, gave her name, unknown female, mid-20s, possible assault. Oena watched from a corridor, fists clenched in his suit pockets. He had come from a broken world, clawed his way to power, lost his wife to illness, and raised his son alone. He thought he was numb to suffering. But something about that girl in the trash gnawed at him. He didn't know who she was, or why fate had drawn him to that street. But he knew one thing. She wasn't trash. Not to him. Not anymore. For the next 48 hours, the girl remained unconscious. The doctors ran scans, cleaned her wounds, and stabilized her heartbeat. But she hovered somewhere between life and death, a ghost caught in limbo. Oena barely left the hospital. He canceled his meetings, ignored his board's complaints, and sent his son to stay with his sister for a few days. Something in his gut told him this wasn't just pity. This was something deeper. She wasn't nameless to him anymore. Even in her silence, she had invaded a part of his spirit that he had sealed after losing his wife. At night, he would sit by the hospital window, watching the lights from a city, remembering how grief used to taste. This girl, barely clinging to breath, reminded him of something raw, something real. The nurses began to gossip, of course. "Olga must know her from somewhere," one said. "Abina's side chick," another joked. But Oena didn't respond. He didn't care. He just wanted her to wake up. On the third day, she stirred. It was barely a twitch, then a gasp, then a weak groan. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing dull, pain-laced eyes that looked around without recognition. She tried to sit up but winced and collapsed. When the nurse asked her name, she whispered, "Amarachi." Her voice was dry, cracking like old paper. Oena, standing by the corner, felt the name echo. "Amarachi." Grace. The irony stung. She tried to speak, then burst into a coughing fit. When her eyes finally found Oena, there was confusion and fear. "Who are you?" she croaked. "I found you," he said simply. She blinked, then turned away, ashamed. Oena saw her tears leak down the bandage near her temple. He asked nothing else. No pressure, just silence. That night she slept again, but this time her breathing was calmer, steadier. The next day, Amarachi sat up fully. She was frail, arms like sticks, cheeks sunken. But her eyes, though haunted, now held life. Oena brought her warm food and clean clothes. She barely touched them at first. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Oena paused. He didn't have the answer. "Because someone should have," he replied. Amarachi stared at him a long while, then began to cry, not loudly, not dramatically, but the kind of quiet, exhausted weeping that comes from someone who hasn't felt safe in a long, long time. As her body trembled, Oena stepped outside the room. His heart clenched painfully. Whoever had broken her didn't just harm her body. They stole her dignity. He didn't know who did this. Not yet. But he would find out. And God help whoever they were. Days passed, and slowly, Amarachi's body began to respond to care. The bruises faded. The swelling went down. Her hair was washed, her skin gently cleaned, her nails trimmed. But the healing of her soul was another matter. She barely spoke unless prompted. When she did, her answers were clipped, guarded. She flinched when men walked too close. She panicked when left alone in the dark. But through it all, Oena remained near. Not demanding, not overbearing, just present. One evening, as rain whispered against the windows, he brought her a book. "You seem like someone who used to read," he said. She stared at the cover, half of a yellow Sunday. Her lips trembled. "It was my favorite," she whispered. It was the first time he saw a flicker of the girl behind the scars. That night, she opened up piece by piece. She used to be a medical student at UNN, top of her class. A bright girl with dreams of becoming a surgeon. "People used to call me a light," she said, voice tinged with bitterness. Then she met Tenna, a final-year business student with charm, ambition, and lies. "He made me feel seen," she whispered, eyes distant. "Said he loved me. Promised to help me escape poverty. He loaned money in her name, encouraged her to co-sign documents she didn't understand. Soon, she was in debt. When she resisted, he grew violent. One day, he beat me, then left." Her voice broke. "Said I was stupid for thinking a girl like me could be a queen." Amarachi had tried to fight, but her family turned on her, calling her a disgrace. Her uncles cursed her. Her aunt said she should have just married the old chief who wanted her. So she ran, and the streets swallowed her whole. Oena listened in silence, fists clenched. Each word stabbed like fire. He had seen men like Tenna before, smooth-talking parasites who used women like currency. But this time, it was personal. Amarachi wasn't just a broken stranger. She was brilliance buried in filth. Potential erased by cruelty. "He dumped me like trash," she said finally. "And I believed I was." Oena stood, walked over, and knelt beside her bed. "You were never trash," he said softly. "And I promise you, the world will know that." Her eyes welled with disbelief. She had heard promises before, but this one didn't sound like pity. It sounded like war. Amarachi's memories came in waves, some soft, others violent, but none so deeply embedded in her bones as the day she met Tenna. He had shown up during her second year in medical school, dressed in crisp white linen, with a voice like jazz and lies as sweet as honey. He stood tall, confident, a final-year business student with influence, connections, and a flirtatious charm that made even the proudest girls look twice. But it wasn't just his charm that caught Amarachi. It was how he listened. When she talked about her dreams of becoming a surgeon and helping rural communities, he didn't laugh like others had. Instead, he looked at her like she was already a star. And for a girl raised in scarcity, whose parents died before she could graduate secondary school, whose aunt constantly reminded her that love was a luxury for rich girls, Tenna felt like a miracle. He made her believe that she could live in both worlds, brilliance and romance. What Amarachi didn't know was that Tenna didn't fall for women. He hunted them. It started subtly, little requests, small sacrifices. He forgot his wallet one day, borrowed money the next. He convinced her to help him register for a business conference. Then he came with grand ideas. Let's invest together. I'll build you a clinic someday. Just trust me. Amarachi, who had never been taught the language of deception, mistook manipulation for partnership. She co-signed on a small student loan for him, thinking love meant loyalty. When the school authorities threatened to expel her for unpaid debt, Tenna turned cold. Handle your own mess, he snapped when she begged him to pay. The night he hit her was the same night he emptied her account and left with her documents. You think you're special? He spat, shoving her to the ground in the dark corner of their rented lodge room. You're just another stupid girl with a good brain and no street sense. Amarachi had never cried harder. She didn't scream. She didn't even curse him. She just sat there, knees bleeding, mind spinning, realizing that love could have claws and teeth. What followed was worse. Her scholarship sponsors withdrew after false rumors of indecent conduct. She was reported for academic fraud. Someone had forged her signature on an exam paper. All the signs pointed to Tenna, but he was gone. When she returned to her aunt's house in ABA, she was met with disgust. I told you, her aunt hissed. You refused the old chief that wanted you. See your life now. Her uncles tried to force her into a quick marriage to a man old enough to be her father. They said it was the only way to clean her name and settle the family's disgrace. Amarachi refused. She would rather sleep on the street than marry a stranger for atonement. And so they cast her out. Her only bag was a plastic nylon filled with second-hand clothes and her dream journal, now water-stained and unread. Tenna had not just stolen her savings or dignity. He had stolen her foundation and left her buried beneath shame. Amarachi began to roam, from night markets to roadside shelters, believing that perhaps death would be kinder than life ever had been. When Amarachi arrived in Lagos, it wasn't out of hope, it was out of exile. Her aunt, who once swore she would raise her like a daughter, had tossed her out in the middle of the night with the same hand that once caressed her cheek during bedtime prayers. The betrayal stung even deeper than Tenna's. After all, he was a stranger cloaked in charm. But her family? They knew her. They knew how hard she worked. They knew her dreams, her integrity. Yet when the storm hit, they didn't protect her. They sacrificed her to shame and called it tradition. For weeks, Amarachi wandered. She slept in market stalls when kind vendors allowed it. She fetched water for roadside food sellers in exchange for leftover akra. She washed clothes behind people's compounds just to afford sachet water. 1 week turned into 1 month. She tried to apply for menial jobs, housekeeper, nanny, server, but without ID or a reference, doors shut in her face. And even when one opened, it came with cruel conditions. You'll sleep here, one man told her, but you'll warm my bed when I say so. The rejection became normal, the hunger bearable. But the loneliness, the soul-deep kind, began to rot her from within. She stopped looking at her reflection in car mirrors, stopped speaking more than necessary, stopped praying. Her faith, once vibrant and burning, felt like ashes in her throat. One night, she fainted beside a pile of waste while trying to find discarded bread from a shop's trash. Her vision blurred, and her heart thudded weakly. Her last thought wasn't fear. It was numbness. That perhaps if she slept long enough, she wouldn't wake up. No one would miss her. Her name wouldn't be whispered. There would be no obituary, no grave, no flowers. Just silence. In that silence, she collapsed. That was the night Chief Oena found her. The night fate gave her one more breath, one more hand, one more chance. Now sitting in the hospital, Amarachi told Oena her story in fragments, her eyes fixed on a faraway wall, like if she stared long enough, she'd see the version of herself she used to be, the one with neat braids, a stethoscope in her dreams, and laughter in her voice. She didn't cry while telling the story. The tears had dried long ago. They didn't just reject me, she said quietly. They erased me, like I was never worthy of love. Oena listened without interrupting. He didn't ask if it was all true. He didn't need proof. The pain in her voice was realer than any document. I don't want pity, Amarachi added, finally looking at him. I want to matter. Just once. I want to feel like I was born for more than this. Her voice cracked. Is that too much? Oena didn't answer immediately. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a worn black and white photo of his late wife, a woman with fierce eyes and gentle strength. She once said that those who survive the fire carry gold in their bones, he whispered. You don't know it yet, Amarachi, but you're carrying more gold than you think. The next morning, Oena stood at the hospital window, sipping black coffee while watching Amarachi sleep. Something about her haunted him, unsettled him. Not in a burdensome way, but like a forgotten song he once loved and couldn't name. He thought of his late wife, Oena, who died of cancer 6 years ago. She had been the one who softened his edges, challenged his pride, reminded him that compassion was not weakness. Since her passing, Oena had buried himself in work, in money, in building an empire that made headlines. But it was hollow now. The glass towers, luxury cars, million-naira deals. None had moved him the way Amarachi's brokenness did. He remembered his own childhood, barefoot and hungry. The days when he and his siblings fought over who got to drink Gary soaked with the last spoon of milk. His mother, a midwife, died giving birth to his baby sister. His father, a struggling mechanic, worked himself into the grave. Oena clawed his way out of the trenches. But somewhere along the way, he forgot what survival truly looked like. Until he saw Amarachi. That afternoon, his assistant called. Sir, you've missed 3 meetings. The board is complaining. And there are rumors. Oena sighed. Let them talk, he said. He canceled all events for the week. When the hospital asked if they should transfer Amarachi to a general ward due to high-profile patients arriving, Oena refused. She stays here, he said. She's not a stray dog. The nurses obeyed. But whispers grew louder. Why was the billionaire obsessed with a gutter girl? Was she blackmailing him? Was he bewitched? But Oena didn't care. Every time he saw her try to walk despite her weak knees, or whisper prayers to herself at night, or flinch at loud noises, he felt something crack in him. Something that had been frozen for too long. This wasn't about charity anymore. It was personal. She wasn't just someone he rescued. She had awoken something sacred in him. The memory of pain, the duty to protect, and a voice that asked, what if she were your daughter? That evening, Oena sat beside her bed and asked the question he had avoided. What's your plan now, Amarachi? She looked at him with honest emptiness. I don't know, she whispered. I don't even know who I am anymore. Oena nodded, then took a long breath. Then let's figure it out together. She looked away, skeptical. Why would a man like you help someone like me? She asked. Because once, he said softly, someone gave me a chance when I had nothing. If they hadn't, I wouldn't be Chief Oena today. Amarachi looked at him, tears threatening to fall. But they didn't. Instead, she gave him a faint nod. That night, as Oena left the hospital wing, he passed a framed newspaper article in the hallway titled, The Billionaire with No Heirs, but a Nation of Orphans. He paused, smiled bitterly, and muttered under his breath, maybe I just found one. It was a quiet Thursday afternoon, and sunlight dripped lazily through the hospital blinds when Amarachi began telling a story she hadn't spoken of in years. Her voice was steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she sipped from a bowl of hot pepper soup Oena had sent over. There was a little boy once, she began, eyes fixed on the wall. He was maybe 7 or 8. He got caught in a stampede at a school during a scholarship outreach. Everyone was running, screaming, trampling each other. I don't know why, but I couldn't leave him. I pulled him out from under some fallen desks, covered his head with my backpack, and hid behind a broken chalkboard until the noise died down. Oena, who had entered the room mid-sentence, froze at the mention of the incident. His pulse slowed. Where was this? He asked. I think it was in Succa, a private school. Rich kids, some poor ones too. It was chaotic, she said. The boy had a birthmark on his neck, big eyes, and he kept calling for his Uncle Chica. Amarachi didn't notice the way Oena's cup slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. Oena excused himself with a muttered apology and walked briskly out of the room. His heart thundered in his chest as memories crashed against him. Nsuka. 8 years ago. His only son, Chuka, had once attended a scholarship camp in that region. A stampede broke out during one of the sessions, and Oena remembered the call from a school. "Sir, your son was found unconscious. A girl protected him, but she left before we could thank her." At the time, Oena was overwhelmed with work and grief from his wife's recent passing. He sent donations to the school and brushed the incident off. But now, years later, the puzzle pieces slammed together. Amarachi was the girl. She had saved his son. A girl abandoned by the world had protected what was most precious to him. His breath caught in his throat. And yet, she hadn't mentioned this story to gain favor. She had said it casually, like it didn't matter. But it mattered. Everything about it mattered. For the first time, Oena saw not just a broken woman, but a divine intersection, a loop of fate. She had given him life, and now he had unknowingly returned it. Back in the hospital room, Amarachi quietly wiped her mouth and folded the napkin on her lap. She hadn't realized how deep the memory of that day had been buried. "The boy cried so much," she said softly to herself, unaware Oena was listening from the hallway. "He held my hand so tight. I was scared too. But somehow, I had to be strong for him." Oena returned moments later, calmer, more composed. He didn't tell her what he'd realized, not yet. Instead, he sat by her bedside and looked at her with new eyes. "You're braver than most people I know," he said. Amarachi shrugged, unsure how to respond. She didn't know that she had just uncovered the reason she had been spared, the reason Oena had felt drawn to her the moment he saw her in the trash. Sometimes, the seeds we sow in silence bloom years later, in the hearts of those who were watching all along. It was a week later when Amarachi walked again, this time without a nurse by her side. Oena had pulled a few strings and offered her a small space at one of his outreach centers, not far from the hospital. "You can help out, assist with logistics," he said casually, not wanting her to feel like charity. Amarachi accepted with quiet gratitude. It was her first time in months wearing clean clothes that actually fit, her hair braided neatly by one of the foundation staff. She felt human again, almost. That day, Oena held a business meeting with some of his key executives at the same center, young men and women he had mentored over the years. Amarachi kept to her corner, sorting boxes of supplies and organizing folders for the Women's Aid Program. That was when he arrived, to Tenna, dressed in an expensive navy blue suit, carrying the scent of cologne and false humility. He greeted everyone with laughter and handshakes, his smile flashing like a weapon. Amarachi didn't see his face at first, only heard the voice. That voice. Her heart stopped. She turned slowly, and their eyes met. The blood drained from her face. Her knees buckled. The papers in her hand slipped to the floor. Time stood still. Tenna's smile faltered for the briefest second, then quickly returned. A politician's grin layered over poison. "Amarachi," he said, feigning confusion. "Wow, I didn't expect to see you here." Oena noticed the change in the air. He stepped forward, looking between them. "You two know each other?" he asked. Amarachi didn't speak. Her lips quivered, hands shaking. Tenna stepped forward casually. "She's someone I used to know at university," he said. "We lost touch." Amarachi finally found her voice, low, trembling. "He's the one," she whispered to Oena. "The one who ruined me." Obena's eyes narrowed. "What?" Amarachi turned fully to face him now, voice rising. "This is Tenna, the man I told you about. The one who tricked me, beat me, left me in debt. He's the one." Silence fell like thunder. All eyes turned to Tenna. He forced a laugh. "She's confused. Probably still struggling mentally. It's sad what trauma does to people." But Oena didn't laugh. He stared at Tenna for a long, long time, something cold growing behind his eyes. "Amarachi isn't confused," he said. "And you will respect her here." Tenna's mask slipped slightly. His jaw tightened. "Sir, I think—" "Enough," Oena interrupted. "We'll talk later. Privately." Amarachi stood frozen, every part of her body tense. She had seen Tenna's anger before, knew the darkness he hid beneath tailored suits and fancy English. After the meeting, Oena pulled Amarachi aside. "Are you sure?" he asked. She nodded. Her voice was firm now. "I'd recognize that monster in any lifetime." Oena placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then I believe you." That night, Amarachi didn't sleep. Not from fear, but from fury. After everything she had survived, Tenna had built success on her bones. But not anymore. She had a voice now. And this time, she wouldn't be silenced. Oena was not a man who acted on impulse, but once his instincts were lit, he pursued truth like a bloodhound. That night, after leaving Amarachi's side, he drove to his private office, dismissed the night staff, and opened Tenna's personnel file. Everything on paper looked perfect: glowing reviews, strong quarterly performance, excellent client relations. But Oena knew that success, in the wrong hands, could be stolen, not earned. He called his private investigator, Mr. Bacco, a former police detective who now specialized in quiet corporate cleanups. Dig into Tenna's past, university records, financials, personal affiliations. "I want everything. And do it quietly," he ordered. Bacco grunted. "You suspect fraud?" "I suspect a wolf in a suit," Oena replied. 2 days later, the first file arrived. A sealed envelope dropped on his desk at dawn. Oena sat with it in silence, heart heavy with dread. When he opened it, what he saw made his jaw clench. Tenna had a history, not just of fraud, but of calculated emotional manipulation. At least 4 female students during his university years had reported suspicious harassment, but all charges were dropped mysteriously. One of them had withdrawn from school entirely. Another attempted suicide. His records had been quietly scrubbed, possibly paid off or threatened. Financially, there were odd discrepancies. Tenna had declared bankruptcy just before suddenly rising in wealth again, funneling payments through shell accounts and partnerships with shady entities. But the real shock was the loan, the same one Amarachi had co-signed. It hadn't been closed, it was active, with her name still on the liability report. Tenna had used her identity even after leaving her. Oena slammed the folder shut, shaking with fury. He had built a platform for this man, mentored him, praised him. Meanwhile, the woman who saved his son had been buried in shame, hunted by the consequences of a fraud she didn't commit. Oena called a meeting the next morning. Private, quiet, off the record. Tenna arrived smug and relaxed, but his confidence wavered when he saw the seriousness in Oena's eyes. "I did some digging," Oena said calmly. "You've been a very clever boy." Tenna tried to speak, but Oena raised a hand. "Save it. I have the files. And I have the witness. You'll be stepping aside from the foundation with immediate effect, and I'll be conducting a deeper audit. If I find anything else, I won't hesitate to hand you over to the authorities." Tenna's facade crumbled slightly. "Sir, you're making a mistake." "No," Oena said coldly. "You made the mistake. You hurt the wrong woman." That afternoon, Oena returned to Amarachi and laid the file gently in her lap. "You were right," he said. She didn't open it. She just breathed. For the first time in years, someone had believed her, without a doubt. And for the first time in his life, Chief Oena Okafor realized that the woman he thought he saved might be the one saving him from blindness all along. The scandal was still quietly unfolding behind boardroom doors when Amarachi walked into the Foundation's hallway the next day, unaware that her past had already triggered a chain of reckoning. She wore a simple cream blouse and dark trousers, her hair braided neatly back, but her posture betrayed hesitation. She had grown used to being invisible, used to people pretending she wasn't there or wishing she wasn't. But now, eyes followed her, not with pity, not with admiration, but with suspicion. The whispers were louder. "That's the girl from the streets. Did you hear? The Ogade protect am like wife. Abina jazz." Amarachi tried to ignore them, keeping her gaze low and her steps careful. But words can be louder than fists, and gossip, especially rich, venomous gossip, has a way of turning even walls against you. She felt the weight of a society that had already judged her story by the dirt she once wore, not by the dignity she was trying to reclaim. Oena noticed. He had seen the shift too. A few of his colleagues at the board had raised eyebrows during strategy calls. "Sir, this girl, she's not good for PR," one said. Another, bolder, asked outright, "What are you doing with her, really?" Oena, for all his wealth and power, felt the sting of their judgment, but not for the reason they thought. It wasn't shame. It was fury. He couldn't believe how easily these men and women, who had once begged him for contracts and favors, now dared to look down on someone who had lost everything and still had the courage to live. That evening, he watched Amarachi from his office window as she helped a young mother fill out a form at the reception desk. The child on the woman's lap smiled at Amarachi, and she smiled back, genuine, warm, even though her eyes were clearly tired. Oena clenched his jaw. How could anyone see that and call her trash? Later that night, Oena visited her room, humble and neatly arranged, and sat across from her on the small couch. He said nothing for a moment, just watched her rearrange a stack of books. "I know people are talking," he finally said. Amarachi nodded slowly. "They always do." "Do you want to leave?" he asked. She looked up at him, and for the first time, there was a flicker of steel in her eyes. "No," she said. "I won't run anymore. Let them talk." Oena exhaled. That was what he needed to hear. "Good. Because you're not trash, Amarachi. You're not some charity project. You're treasure. And I want the world to see that, starting with my world." Amarachi swallowed hard. She had waited her entire life for someone to say that without expecting anything in return. It wasn't just words, it was restoration. That night she cried not from sorrow, but from the terrifying, unfamiliar feeling of being valued. Amarachi's recovery, both physical and emotional, became more evident with each passing day. The foundation gave her a desk job, low level at first, but it gave her purpose. Her routine became steady. Wake at dawn, pray in whispers, help organize documents, attend planning sessions for outreach events. The other staff members remained polite but distant. Some ignored her altogether. But Amarachi didn't flinch. She focused on her work with diligence and precision, correcting inventory errors, refining logistical charts, and making suggestions that even impressed the project lead. "Where did you say you schooled again?" one asked, half curious, half condescending. "University of Nigeria, Nsukka," she replied. "I was studying medicine." That quiet revelation caused a stir. Some began to watch her differently, not with empathy, but with curiosity and quiet competitiveness. One or two of them tried to befriend her, but Amarachi remained cautious. She knew how people's warmth could vanish with a single rumor. Still, she stood taller now. Her clothes were ironed, her voice steadier. Her laugh, though rare, sounded less like an echo of pain and more like a note of hope. Oena noticed the changes too. He didn't coddle her, didn't interfere in her work unless necessary. But he watched the way she carried herself, watched how she listened in meetings, only speaking when she had something worth saying, watched how the younger girls in the women's shelter asked for her specifically, calling her Sister Amarachi. He was proud, yes, but more than that, he was humbled. This was what strength looked like, not brute force or bank balances, but a woman who had every reason to vanish into bitterness and chose grace instead. Oena began inviting her to more strategic meetings, slowly easing her into roles that demanded leadership. When some of his inner circle questioned it, he simply said, "She earned it. That's all that matters." And truly, Amarachi had. Every drop of blood, every bruise, every tear had prepared her for this new chapter, not one of pity, but of purpose. One afternoon, while preparing a speech for a girls' empowerment seminar, Amarachi sat quietly in the garden behind the foundation building. Oena joined her with 2 bottles of malt, handing one to her wordlessly. They sat for a while, sipping and listening to birdsong. "Do you miss who you were?" he asked eventually. Amarachi didn't answer immediately. She stared at the flowers, bright, alive, blooming. "I miss her innocence," she said softly, "but not her blindness. That girl believed love without proof. She trusted without discernment. She wanted to save the world before she even learned how to save herself. Oena nodded, touched by her honesty. "And who are you now?" he asked. She looked at him, firm and sure. "I'm a woman who knows what it means to lose everything and still wake up the next day. I'm learning to stand again. And I'm not doing it for applause. I'm doing it for myself." And in that moment, Oena realized that even if the world still doubted her, Amarachi no longer doubted herself. And that made all the difference. News travels fast in the circles of Lagos wealth, and scandal travels faster. The whispers surrounding Chief Oena and the mysterious woman he'd plucked from the gutter had reached cocktail parties in Lekki, prayer brunches in Ikoyi, and executive dinners in Victoria Island. The rumors were all painted with the same acid. Oena's finally lost it. She must be using jazz. What does a billionaire see in a street girl? Some media outlets even tried to probe the story, hoping for a juicy exposé. One headline draft that never got published read, "From trash to trophy, the woman living in the billionaire's shadow." Oena's PR team worked overtime to shut it down. But Oena didn't care about the press. What hurt him was that some of the people he considered close friends, those he'd helped build empires, were now scorning him for choosing kindness. One even warned him during a board dinner, "Careful, Oena. Pity can be expensive." Oena had looked him straight in the eyes and replied, "And cruelty can cost a soul." Amarachi heard the rumors too. She wasn't deaf. Staff whispered behind her back. Drivers pointed. Even some of the young women she was mentoring began to question her story, having read snippets online or heard twisted versions from jealous interns. It crushed her, but not because of what was said. She had endured worse. What crushed her was the realization that society didn't care about truth. They didn't want to hear how she'd saved a life, fought through hunger, clawed her way back from a brink. They just wanted a story to mock, a fable to laugh at. Amarachi wanted to run, to leave the foundation and vanish before the gossip buried her again. But when she returned to her office one morning, she found a letter on her desk, handwritten by one of the women in the shelter. "Thank you for listening to me. I didn't jump off that bridge because you made me believe I mattered. You saved me." Amarachi folded the note, placed it against her chest, and wept silently. Let them gossip. She knew now that her presence was power. Later that week, at a charity event attended by CEOs and politicians, Oena shocked the room by inviting Amarachi to give the keynote address. Gasps echoed. Whispers swirled. But Amarachi walked to that stage in a floor-length emerald gown donated by a local designer she once helped feed through the foundation. Her voice shook at first, but found strength as she spoke. "I was once called trash, thrown away, laughed at. But I stand here not as a product of your labels, but as proof that pain doesn't have the final word." The applause at the end wasn't unanimous, but it was loud enough. Oena stood proudly. That night, as the city lights glittered behind them and car engines roared outside the event hall, Amarachi looked at her reflection in the tinted window and saw not the girl who slept by the trash, but a woman who had survived it. And this time, she wasn't ashamed of the journey that brought her here. It was almost evening when Tenna barged into Amarachi's office uninvited. The door slammed shut behind him, the sound sending a sharp jolt through her spine. She stood, slowly, calmly, the way one stands when confronted by a memory that once destroyed them, but no longer holds the same power. He looked different now, not the playful, charming university senior she once knew, but harder, angrier. Still, the arrogance in his smirk remained. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed. Amarachi didn't answer. Her silence was deliberate. It made him angrier. You show up here, start flapping your mouth like a victim, and suddenly everyone believes you. She raised her head, her expression unreadable. "I didn't show up anywhere. I was found." Tenna sneered. "You and your savior, Oena. Do you think he'll keep protecting you when he finds out what you really are?" Amarachi stepped forward, her voice low but firm. "He already knows everything. You destroyed me once, Tenna. You won't do it again." Tenna's mask cracked. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small envelope. I came here to offer you a deal, he said, tossing it on her desk. Take this money. Leave Lagos. Go far away. Disappear. Or you'll regret what happens next. Amarachi stared at the envelope like it was a dirty rag. I don't want your money, she said. I want my name back. I want justice. He laughed bitterly. Justice? You think the world cares about justice? You're lucky anyone even looks at you twice. You're nothing but— Finish that sentence, Amarachi interrupted coldly, her eyes locked on his. Go ahead. Say it. Remind me who you really are. Tenna hesitated. For a moment, he looked at her the way a wolf realizes the prey it once hunted has grown teeth. You don't know who you're messing with, he growled. Amarachi took a deep breath. No, she said. You don't know who I've become. Security arrived moments later. Oena had anticipated something like this and quietly stationed 2 guards outside her office. Tenna was escorted out, red-faced, muttering curses under his breath. Amarachi sat back down, her fingers trembling slightly, but her spine straight. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. Instead, she opened her laptop and returned to her work. That act alone felt revolutionary. Hours later, Oena arrived, having heard what happened. You okay? He asked. Amarachi nodded. He tried to buy my silence, she said. He still thinks I'm for sale. Oena's face darkened. Not anymore, he said. Not ever again. And for the first time since that dark chapter began, Amarachi felt something shift, not just in the room, but within herself. She had faced the devil who once held her chains and didn't flinch. She had won a war without raising her voice. And that, she realized, was a victory no one could ever steal. That night, Amarachi lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word, every insult, every cruel smile Tenna had once used to break her. It should have been behind her, buried with the girl she used to be. But trauma doesn't follow a linear timeline. It resurfaces in flashes, in the way someone's cologne triggers nausea, or the way a slammed door brings back the sound of fists. For hours, she couldn't sleep. She finally rose and pulled out the old journal she had kept from university, tattered, water-stained, but still hers. In it, she had once written dreams. Open a rural clinic, build a scholarship for girls, become a surgeon by 30. But near the back were pages filled with secrets she never told anyone. How Tenna had gaslit her, made her question her sanity, and once filmed her crying during an argument just to mock her later. Reading it all made her sick, but it also made her strong. She was no longer ashamed. The truth was finally out. And with that truth came a responsibility, to speak not just for herself, but for the girls who never got a second chance. The following day, Amarachi requested a private conversation with Oena. They met in his study, a quiet room filled with mahogany shelves and the scent of old books. She sat across from him and placed the journal on the table. There's more, she said. More than what I told you. Oena's brow furrowed. Amarachi took a breath and opened to a page dated 3 weeks before her collapse. Tenna didn't just abandon me, she began. He stole my ID, took out more loans in my name. And then her voice cracked. He sold my contact details to some of his friends. I started receiving messages, demands. One night someone followed me home and— She couldn't continue. Oena's hand clenched into a fist. He trafficked you? Amarachi nodded slowly, tears welling. I escaped before anything happened. But it was clear I wasn't safe. That's when my aunt said I had become a disgrace. That's when I left. Silence fell like a veil in the room. Oena had heard countless stories of suffering, but this one crawled under his skin and stayed there like fire. Why didn't you tell me earlier? He asked gently. Because I didn't want you to see me as broken, she replied. I wanted to earn your respect, not beg for your pity. Oena leaned forward. Listen to me carefully, he said, his voice low and burning. You don't need to earn anything. You already have my respect. Not because of what you survived, but because you chose to keep living after it. Amarachi sobbed quietly, her head in her hands. Oena rose and placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. We're going to make sure this man faces justice. Not just for what he did to you, but for what he could do to others. No more silence. No more shame. And in that moment, Amarachi knew the war had officially begun. The kind of war that wasn't fought with weapons, but with truth. The kind that would hurt before it healed. But she was no longer a victim. She was a witness. And now she was ready to speak. In the days that followed, Amarachi's voice became a force. She began working with Oena's legal team to file a formal complaint. It wouldn't be easy. Tenna had influence, allies, and money. But Amarachi had something else: evidence. Screenshots. Messages. Audio recordings she had saved and buried deep within her email drafts as insurance. She had almost deleted them years ago, but something made her hold on. Now, they were her sword. The team began building a case, and soon Amarachi became more than just a survivor. She became a leader. Inspired by her courage, several other women came forward anonymously, claiming similar experiences with Tenna. Some had stayed silent for years, fearing retaliation. Amarachi's strength gave them a voice. She started visiting shelters, sharing parts of her story in coded language, letting broken girls know they weren't alone. The more she spoke, the more she healed. And in healing others, she began to repair the shattered pieces inside herself. Oena was in awe. He had seen CEOs crumble under far less pressure. But Amarachi stood tall, not with pride, but with clarity. One evening, during a women's empowerment forum, she was asked to speak. She stood at the podium in a simple Ankara dress, no makeup, her hair in a low bun, and said, "I once believed strength meant never breaking. But now I know, true strength is breaking and choosing to rebuild anyway, piece by painful piece." The hall went quiet, then erupted in applause. Oena watched from the sidelines, heart full. He had once seen her lying in trash, lifeless. Now she stood before a crowd, commanding hope. It wasn't just a transformation. It was a resurrection. Later, as they rode back together, Oena turned to her. "You've built something even I couldn't build," he said. "What's that?" she asked, smiling softly. "A movement," he replied. "One born from truth. And that's more powerful than any empire." That night, alone in her room, Amarachi stood in front of the mirror and studied herself. The bruises were gone. The scars faded. But she saw something else now: fire. A fire she once feared was extinguished. She touched her heart gently. "You survived," she whispered to her reflection. "And now you rise." In the drawer beside her bed sat the same journal that once held her silent screams. Now it held blueprints for a new future. Ideas for a women's academy. A scholarship in her name. Plans for outreach centers across Nigeria. And she would build them, not because the world owed her anything, but because she had finally remembered who she was before the pain. And who she was unstoppable. Tenna had always believed himself untouchable. Even as rumors began to swirl and the tension in the foundation offices thickened like Lagos humidity, he walked with the same smug arrogance. The kind of entitlement that comes from years of getting away with everything. His allies in Oena's empire whispered support behind closed doors, but began to keep a calculated distance in public. Still, Tenna thought he could talk his way out of anything, charm his way through any mess. What he didn't realize was that Amarachi wasn't the same quiet girl he once manipulated. She had become a storm. And Oena? He was no longer blinded by the mask Tenna wore. Behind the scenes, Oena's private audit team had uncovered damning evidence, not just of fraud, but of deliberate embezzlement, ghost accounts, and a fake consultancy firm Tenna used to siphon foundation funds into personal accounts. Oena didn't act immediately. He let the web tighten, let the snake slither deeper into exposure, until there was no more room to hide. In the boardroom the following week, Oena called an emergency meeting. Senior partners, auditors, legal counsel. Amarachi sat in the corner quietly, present only as a witness, her presence a silent message. "This is for all the days you thought I wouldn't rise." Tenna entered the room late, confident as always, but the shift in the air was undeniable. Oena stood and presented the findings, one document after another. Money trails, falsified invoices, partnerships with non-existent vendors. As the evidence piled, Tenna's face drained of color. He tried to speak, but Oena silenced him with one hand. For years, you wore a mask and called it ambition, he said. But ambition without integrity is rot. And this company, this foundation, will not rot under my watch. Tenna lashed out, accusing Oena of betrayal, of being blinded by a woman's lies. She's turning you against your own people, he shouted. Oena didn't blink. You turned yourself against this company the moment you decided her life didn't matter. By the end of the meeting, Tenna was suspended indefinitely, his office sealed, his security access revoked. Amarachi didn't speak once, but when she stood to leave, she looked him dead in the eyes. And in that moment, Tenna saw it, not hate, but strength. A strength forged in fire, shaped in rejection, and now sculpted into quiet power. He turned away first. The man who once left her to die in the street now couldn't face her. Outside, Amarachi stood beside Oena, watching the clouds gather. Is it over? She asked. Not yet, Oena replied. But the beginning of his end has begun. They both knew the final blow wouldn't be corporate. It would be public. And when it came, it wouldn't just be about exposing a man. It would be about reclaiming every voice he ever tried to silence. The media frenzy began slowly, a leaked memo here, a whispered tip to a blog there, until Tenna's name trended on every social media platform. Charity fraud scandal, they called it. Foundation executive caught in sex for opportunity allegations. Oena's legal team remained composed, issuing only one statement: we believe in justice, truth, and transparency. No one is above accountability. But behind the scenes, the real storm was brewing. Amarachi had officially filed a criminal complaint, and several other women, once afraid to speak, began submitting affidavits. Some came anonymously. Some were broken in voice. But all pointed to the same man, a manipulator who used power to prey on weakness. The press hunted Amarachi for comment, but she declined. She didn't need to talk to reporters. She was preparing for court. And this time, her truth would not be dismissed by a panel of old men with blindfolds made of money. The courtroom was packed the day of the preliminary hearing. Civil society groups, women's rights activists, and curious citizens filled every available seat. Oena arrived quietly, sitting at the back. He didn't want to overshadow Amarachi. This was her fight, and she would walk into that courtroom not as his project, but as her own woman. Amarachi wore a simple black gown, no jewelry, her natural hair pulled into a bun. When she took the stand, the room held its breath. Her voice trembled at first, but it didn't falter. She told her story, not just the facts, but the feelings, the fear, the betrayal, the way she had been discarded and forced into hiding. The judge listened. The audience listened. Even Tenna, sitting at the defense table, couldn't look away. His lawyer tried to discredit her, poked at her past, called her unreliable. She has no proof, he argued. But Amarachi reached into her folder and pulled out the screenshots, the messages, the audio clip. One recording in particular echoed through the courtroom. Tenna's voice laughing, calling her a naive idiot who thought love was free. Gasps filled the room. The judge called for order. And just like that, the tide shifted. What was once rumor became evidence. What was once doubt became clarity. Amarachi stepped down from the stand with tears in her eyes, not from pain, but from release. She had told the world what was done to her, and the world had listened. Outside, a crowd waited. She didn't speak to the cameras, but one young girl reached for her hand and whispered, "You're brave." Amarachi smiled through her tears. She wasn't brave because she stood in court. She was brave because she stood up for the version of herself that once laid in trash, believing no one would ever care. But now the world cared, and the man who once buried her beneath his power was now gasping for his own reputation to breathe. In the days that followed the hearing, the fallout was immediate and brutal. Tenna's face was splashed across every news site in the country. His old schoolmates denounced him. His partners pulled out of contracts. The sponsors of the foundation demanded immediate accountability. The board, under Oena's leadership, voted unanimously to terminate his position and file official charges. His properties were audited, assets frozen, bank accounts flagged for review. The man who once dined with politicians and vacationed in Dubai was now dodging process servers and begging friends for favors. And the worst part for him wasn't just the collapse, it was the shame. His name, once a symbol of ambition, now rang with disgust. Former lovers came forward. Former classmates told stories. A pattern of abuse long buried began surfacing like a graveyard after a flood. Tenna tried to go on social media to deny it all. But the world had heard the recordings, had read the messages, had seen the face of a man who destroyed lives with a smile. Amarachi watched it all quietly. She didn't celebrate. She didn't gloat. She simply kept doing the work, organizing shelters, mentoring girls, helping the legal team support the other women who had come forward. One day, Oena asked her, "Do you feel vindicated?" She thought about it. "I feel free," she answered. "But I also feel sad, not for him, but for how many more are like him. How many are still hiding in power, waiting to ruin another girl's life." Oena nodded solemnly. "Then let's make sure they don't." That week, Amarachi began designing a public campaign called She Matters, aimed at creating safe spaces for women across the country. Oena funded it in full. The campaign launched with Amarachi's face on billboards, not as a victim, but as a woman who fought back and won. And with every headline about Tenna's fall, more girls stepped forward, holding their pain like a torch, no longer afraid to burn away the silence. Eventually, Tenna was arrested. He tried to resist, tried to scream that it was a witch hunt, that Amarachi had plotted it all. But the evidence was too much. The court had made its decision. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison for fraud, attempted trafficking, and sexual coercion. As he was led away in cuffs, he looked back once, not at the cameras, not at his lawyer, but at Amarachi. She didn't smile. She didn't even blink. She simply stood, hands folded, surrounded by the women he tried to break. That image made the front page of every major newspaper the next day. The woman who refused to stay broken. And though the trial had ended, Amarachi's journey was still unfolding. Justice had been served, but something greater had been reclaimed, her power, her name, and her right to exist without shame. And now, she would spend the rest of her life making sure no other girl had to be found near the trash before someone believed she was treasure. The aftermath of the trial did not bring peace immediately. Amarachi found herself suddenly visible in ways she had never prepared for. Invitations flooded her inbox, from women's groups, international NGOs, government panels. Her story had struck a chord, not just because of Tenna's downfall, but because of how many women saw themselves in her. She had become a symbol, a reluctant one at first. For days, she remained indoors, processing everything. From the girl who once slept beside trash heaps, she had now become a mirror for the silent, the abused, and the unseen. Oena gave her space. He didn't smother her with praise. He simply checked in, made sure her meals were delivered, and reminded her, "You don't owe anyone your healing on their timeline." Eventually, Amarachi emerged not because the world demanded it, but because she chose to. Her power was no longer borrowed from anyone. It had become her own. She launched the She Matters Foundation with a clear mission: to serve as both a refuge and a revolution. It wasn't just about shelter. It was about reclaiming voices. She built a mentorship program for teenage girls expelled from school due to early pregnancies or assault scandals. She opened a legal aid clinic for women who couldn't afford justice. She began organizing outreach teams to visit underserved communities, bringing therapy, skill building, and financial literacy to women forgotten by the system. Oena offered the full weight of his empire behind her. But Amarachi insisted on co-ownership, not dependence. "You believed in me when I was nothing," she once told him. "But now I want to build something where no woman has to feel like nothing again." Every ribbon she cut, every woman she mentored, every speech she gave, they weren't just victories. They were offerings to the girl she used to be. One particular afternoon, as she watched young girls in a safe house classroom laughing over math drills, she felt something shift inside her, something soft. Something whole. One of the girls, maybe 10 or 11, came up to her and said, "Auntie Amarachi, are you a queen?" Amarachi smiled. "No, I'm just someone who didn't give up." But the girl wasn't convinced. "My mummy said only queens rise from fire. So I think you are." That night, Amarachi sat on her small balcony with a cup of warm tea, the city's lights flickering like stars beneath her feet. She opened her journal, the same old one she once filled with pain, and began writing again. But this time, the pages were filled with dreams not for herself, but for others. A place where no woman's worth would be measured by what she survived, but by who she dared to become after it. Chief Oena sat in his quiet study, the weight of years in his chest. He had built empires, funded hospitals, sponsored political campaigns, but nothing in his long, storied life had moved him the way Amarachi's journey had. When he first found her beside that pile of trash, he never imagined she would become the woman who would reshape not only the foundation, but his very understanding of purpose. He had always thought power meant control, until she showed him that true power was found in restoration. Watching Amarachi rise had reminded him of the humanity he nearly buried under success. He didn't see her as an achievement. He saw her as a divine interruption, one that rewrote his legacy. He often wondered, what if I hadn't stopped that night? What if I had driven past her like everyone else? The thought haunted him, because if he had, he would have missed the greatest treasure of his life. On her birthday, he surprised her with a private celebration at the new She Matters Center, the largest branch yet. Staff, friends, and beneficiaries gathered under soft lights strung across the compound. There were speeches, laughter, even tears. But when Oena stepped forward, the room hushed. He took the mic and looked directly at Amarachi. "I've been called many things," he began. "A tycoon, a philanthropist, a force." The crowd chuckled lightly. "But no title has meant more to me than the one she gave me, believer. Because long before this movement existed, before this beautiful woman became who she is today, she believed in me too. She gave me back the part of myself I thought I'd buried with my wife." Amarachi's eyes shimmered with emotion. Oena raised a glass. "To the girl who rose from the ashes. To the woman who proved that treasure isn't found in glass towers or golden vaults. Sometimes it lies broken beside a gutter, waiting for someone to look again." After the party, they sat together quietly under the stars. Oena didn't ask for anything. He never had. He had always let her lead her own story. "What now?" he asked gently. Amarachi smiled, a soft, tired smile. "Now we multiply hope," she replied. "Now we build it where they least expect it." He nodded. "And what about love?" Amarachi looked at him, not startled, not unsure, just thoughtful. "Maybe one day," she said, "when I know it won't cost me my voice." He smiled. "Then I'll wait. No rush. I just thank God I didn't miss you entirely." She reached out, touched his hand, and whispered, "You didn't. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. And that was enough." No dramatic kiss. No fairy tale ring. Just two people, once broken, now whole, linked not by romance, but by a redemptive purpose. The story didn't end with riches or revenge. It ended with quiet dignity, rising from dirt, glowing in truth, because the world had called her trash. But Oena had seen treasure. Thank you for watching this video. What did you learn from this story? Drop it in the comments. Please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe to my YouTube channel TOCHI Stories for more.